A lot of moving parts. For more insight into that referendum and the efforts to tackle corruption indeed across Latin America, let's bring in Eduardo Gamarra. He is a political science professor at Florida's International University and also the former director of the Latin America and Caribbean Center. Professor Gamarra, thanks for joining us. How significant do you think is this referendum in Peru?
I think it's quite significant. Significant primarily, though, symbolically. Symbolically because it really brings to an end about, I would say, 3 decades of extraordinarily corrupt administrations. Nearly every president, pre-President Vizcarra, is in jail. Those who aren't in jail are facing investigations. Some are on the lam, as former President Toledo, who sits in California, actually, awaiting extradition. So I think it is significant, but primarily symbolically. How much teeth something like this has, I think we'll see in the months to come.
Odebrech's pay to play in Peru, was just a small chunk of the $800 million it's estimated to have dished out across Latin America. Do you think there's a message in Sunday's vote to other countries in the region?
I think so, and I think, if you mentioned the figure of $800 million, but I think it's sort of a tsunami impact on the political systems just really around the entire hemisphere, from Mexico on south, going through the Dominican Republic, and certainly we saw what's happening in Brazil. In Peru, concretely, I think where you're going to begin to see, and perhaps this will have repercussions across the hemisphere, campaign finance reform. How campaigns are financed. Are they going to be financed publicly? Are they going to extend the period in which campaigns are run? Are they going to allow private sector financing? What about foreign financing of campaigns? I think there are a lot of questions that are going to come up, and they're going to essentially transform the way in which elections are run.
You mentioned there Mexico. We saw voters turn out for AMLO, for López Obrador, and what they said was a rejection of corruption. We saw something similar you mentioned in Brazil, and you touched on this. Is the tide turning in the region?
Well, at least it is in terms of what we see in public opinion polls. I mean, the most important concern across the board, I just finished a survey in the Dominican Republic, for example, the #1 concern is corruption. Yet the problem isn't how people feel about corruption, it's the distrust in institutions that is really eroding trust in democracy, and is really also bringing to the fore leaders that are not necessarily democratic and who don't necessarily want to follow the rules of liberal democracy. So I think when you think about, yes, it's important that people are concerned about democracy, but the impact that we've seen is that it really brings up these alternative leaderships that are not necessarily democratic and that might actually end up being much more corrupt than the previous regimes. Let's just remember, for example, that Fujimori became president of Peru on a corruption platform, that Chavez became president of Venezuela on a corruption platform. And where are they today?
And I was in Peru for the Fujimori trial, Alberto Fujimori, the father of Keiko Fujimori, the opposition leader. This is long before this latest scandal. Why is it that Peru and indeed Latin America is so vulnerable to corruption? You mentioned 30 years. This isn't new.
No, it isn't new, and I think there's a couple of things that most scholars have pointed out. One is the extraordinary weak institutional framework that countries like Peru have had, and the extraordinary need to reform every few years. In other words, not only is there a weakness in terms of institutions, but there's an enormous weakness in terms of the length of time that institutions stay in. So for example, asking now to once again change the structure of Congress, I think this is the way in which Latin America gets into trouble. Saviors come in, they transform the institutional framework, it doesn't have time to gel, and then the cycle repeats itself.
Professor Eduardo Gamarra, we'll have to leave it there from the Florida International University. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.